Right folks, I just want to re-record the video that I recorded last week about the menstrual cycle. I was aware there was some sound issues with it, so hopefully this is a little bit better. I'm just going to go through exactly the same stuff. I know that there's been a few views of it, so if you're, you might have watched it, you might be quite happy. But if you're watching this, it might be because you want to watch it again, and that's absolutely fine. So I'll take you through it. There's one little additional thing when I was posting up the homework. There's one little additional thing which I'll mention at the end, which is worth noting. It is in your notes, and I'll put it in the handout, but it isn't something that I had in the previous video, so just in case you maybe struggle at that point, you might already know what I'm talking about, you've already tried the homework. Anyway, right, so the story is same as the male. Starts in the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus, as you know by now, releases this releaser hormone. And the releaser hormone acts directly on the pituitary gland, and that triggers the pituitary gland to release two hormones. The first one though is not released at the same time as the second one, so we'll focus on firstly on what the pituitary gland does. Is it releases the hormone FSH, which, as you should know by now, stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and that's exactly what it does. It stimulates the formation of a follicle, so it acts on the ovary here. And during the first 14 days of the menstrual cycle, which we call the follicular phase, the follicle develops in the ovary. So that's the first 14 days, and as a result of that follicle developing, the hormone estrogen is released. Okay. Now, estrogen does a couple of things. As we should know, it will build, so we have a small amount at that point, bigger amount, bigger amount, bigger amount. So as the follicle develops, we get more and more estrogen. Estrogen does, as we said, a couple of things. First thing it does is it acts on the endometrium, so it thickens the endometrium. You can hopefully see the thickness of the endometrium increasing as the first 14 days progress. That's due to the levels of estrogen increasing. And also what will eventually happen is estrogen levels, once they reach a certain point, a certain level, they will actually act on the pituitary gland and trigger the pituitary gland to release LH. And like in my last video, when you think LH, you should be thinking ovulation. So ovulation and LH should be intrinsically linked in your mind. So as soon as LH is released by the pituitary gland, ovulation is triggered. And that leaves behind a structure in the ovary called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum starts over the next 14 days, between days 14 and day 28, which we refer to as being the luteal phase. What you can hopefully see from the diagram is that the corpus luteum slowly but surely degrades until it breaks down to nothing. Now, the corpus luteum releases estrogen, but also progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone have the same effect actually as estrogen on its own have on the endometrium. We talk about at this stage estrogen and progesterone maintaining the thickness of the endometrium, not that they thicken it, because at the end of the day it's already thickened. They maintain the thickness of the endometrium at that point. And as the corpus luteum gets smaller, the levels of estrogen and progesterone produced gets less. So there's less and less estrogen and progesterone getting produced as we go from day 14 to day 28. To the point, in fact, that once the corpus luteum completely breaks down, there is no estrogen or progesterone produced, and that's what triggers menstruation, because there's nothing saying for the endometrium to be thickened, there's nothing holding on to the endometrium, so it's released and moves out of the body in the form of menstruation. So that's why that's triggered, because suddenly there's a drop of estrogen and progesterone because there's no corpus luteum anymore. The second thing that estrogen and progesterone do, and I should have mentioned this before as well, estrogen and progesterone have a negative feedback effect on the release of FSH. What that means is that throughout this entire process, or certainly when we get to a point where the estrogen levels are high enough and progesterone levels are high here as well, then there's being a negative effect on the pituitary, so that FSH is not released. And what that does obviously is it prevents another follicle developing when we don't really want that. Through this process from day 1 to day 28, one follicle develops, ovulation occurs, and then one corpus luteum breaks down. And it's only when we get to here, the end of the menstrual cycle, the estrogen progesterone levels are low enough that FSH gets triggered again, and we can start another follicle being developed, and that's when we get into our next menstrual cycle. Okay, so that's the whole cyclical idea of that. Now, that's at the end of the day, that's all you really need to know. As I said before, I mean, I could go through that in a different way, or I could go through it in different words, but at the end of the day, you've got the video now. Watch the video over and over and over again, loop it, pause it, rewind it, bits that you weren't sure of, and just take it step by step, and then try those essays. Try the homework and try the mind map. That's your task for this week, remember. But the remaining thing that I didn't mention in the first video that is reasonably important to mention is that there's another possible outcome from this, of course, and that is that once ovulation occurs, that egg gets fertilised. Now, if the egg is fertilised and the egg that's fertilised implants, then obviously the woman then becomes pregnant. If you're pregnant, you don't want another egg to be released. So what happens is, instead of this, well, the corpus luteum still breaks down to nothing, but what is present is this fertilised egg is implanted in the lining of the endometrium in here, and it continues to release estrogen and progesterone for the duration of pregnancy. So estrogen and progesterone levels remain high even though the corpus luteum's broken down. So this fertilised egg that's implanted in the endometrium is released enough estrogen and progesterone that this negative feedback effect is maintained and FSH is still stopped, so you don't get another follicle developing. And that's, of course, one of the first signs that you are actually pregnant, is the lack of another egg being released, or the lack of a period, the lack of menstruation. And that's because another follicle isn't developed, because the body doesn't want for there to be keeping on being eggs released and potentially fertilised when there's an egg developing in the womb. So in the event of becoming pregnant, in the event of the egg being fertilised, the fertilised egg itself releases estrogen, progesterone, and those high levels are maintained to keep from producing any more FSH. So the negative feedback is maintained by the fertilised egg as opposed to the corpus luteum. So that's a little additional bit that I didn't actually put in the first video. I'm hoping this sounds a bit better. I'm just about to find out. I'll post that, and I'll actually delete the older one as well, just so we don't have the repeated information from two videos. Okay, thanks.